Good afternoon. On behalf of the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI, I would like to welcome you all, first and foremost, our panelists, but those in the audience as well. I am Leila Sterenberg, journalist and senior fellow at CEBRI. Our subject today is Trump 2.0, implications for U.S.-Brazil relations and the future of the Western Hemisphere. The prospect of a new Donald Trump administration introduces a complex landscape for U.S. relations with Latin America and Brazil. Building on the America First policies of his first presidential term, Trump's return to power could signal a continuation of trade protectionism, immigration control, and a transactional approach to diplomacy. However, significant shifts in the regional political context, including the return of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil and the rise of ideologically diverse governments across Latin America, present both challenges and opportunities for U.S. engagement in the region. The alignment between Trump's first administration and the Bolsonaro government exemplified how ideological synergy could facilitate cooperation, particularly in trade, security, and opposition to China's growing influence. In contrast, the Lula government prioritizes multilateralism, environmental governance, and social equity, creating a potential ideological gap with Trump's policies priorities. Similarly, other regional leaders represent diverse ideological spectrums. Javier Milei's libertarian stance in Argentina aligns more closely with Trump's economic outlook, while Gabriel Boric in Chile and Gustavo Petro in Colombia champion progressive agendas that may contrast sharply with Trump's policies. This event, a partnership between CEBRI and Florida International University, FIU, aims to analyze the potential consequences and opportunities of a new Trump administration for Latin America, with a particular focus on Brazil's positioning within this changing regional and global dynamic. Both CEBRI and FIU bring essential expertise and relevance to this discussion. CEBRI, with its long-standing influence in promoting dialogue on international relations, and FIU, a leading academic institution with deep ties to Latin America, together provide a unique platform to explore the geopolitical, economic, and social implications of U.S. policy in the region. Key themes of this event will include the implications of Trump's policies for trade and investment, migration and security, environmental governance, and geopolitical competition in the Americas. By fostering dialogue among policymakers, academics, and stakeholders, the event aims to generate actionable insights and policy recommendations that strengthen U.S.-Latin America relations in a period of political and ideological transition. Our panelists are Rubens Recupero, Trustee Emeritus at CEBRI and former Minister of Finance of Brazil, Brian Fonseca, Director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy and Adjunct Professor at Florida International University, Hussein Kalut, International Advisory Board Member at CEBRI, and former Special Secretary for Strategic Affairs of the Brazilian Presidency, Anthony Pereira, Director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center and Adjunct Professor at FIU. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here. Let's begin with your opening remarks. To kick things off, I give the floor to Ambassador Rubens Recupero. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure indeed to be in such very distinguished company. Just to start, let me state something quite obvious. The level of expectations, of positive expectations regarding prospects with an incoming Trump administration is indeed very low. I think that any surprise in the positive side will be something quite unexpected. People are preparing for the worst. Indeed, I think it was significant that the conceptual note put emphasis on ideological differences. It's true that this will be one of the new factors that will affect relationship in the future, and there is no doubt that it will exert some influence, but I personally don't think it will be the most important or a decisive one in terms of what we could expect in the future. My impression is that from the point of view of the incoming Trump administration, there is at least one bright element, which is the presence as Secretary of State of someone like Marco Rubio, who is quite knowledgeable about Latin America. He himself has roots, personal roots in the region. He speaks fluent Spanish. He knows the countries. So I think it will be a positive factor to have someone in that capacity, which is very rare indeed in the State Department. I myself, I was posted twice at the Brazilian embassy in Washington as a counselor in the mid-70s and as an ambassador in the early 90s. And in both occasions, it was very rare to find people at a high level in the US administration who had this personal and direct knowledge of Latin America. So this, I think, will be a positive thing. In general terms, I don't think that we could expect much common ground with an incoming administration. First of all, in environmental matters. In environmental matters, I think we are going to see a very keen retrocession in terms of multilateral efforts, and I don't think this new administration will mean anything hopeful. And this, of course, could have an early impact in their relationship with Brazil, because Brazil will host, in the first year of the Trump administration, the COP30 in Belém, in the Amazon. And of course, Brazil will count on some support from hemispheric partners in order to have an ambitious agenda. So I count that as a probably minus point immediately. No? In terms of ideological differences, I see two aspects that are of concern to me. One is internal, and another one is more international in nature. The internal one is the fact that Trump's arrival, again, his comeback, will represent a boost to rightist and far-rightist forces all over Latin America. And this is especially strong in Brazil. We have already been seeing some signs of members of Congress of that tendency that have been flocking to the US in recent months to hold talks with the US Congress to plead for pressure on Brazil because of the measures taken against Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, as you know, was considered ineligible in the next elections, and also raising this matter of the behavior of the Brazilian Supreme Court, particularly problems of, as people would put it, of a freedom of expression, which in Brazil, in reality, are considered as part of our arsenal of defense against fake news. So this could mean trouble in the future, because it's not only Trump, but also some Republican members of Congress that have this tendency. The second aspect, which is international and which is not mentioned in the conceptual note, is of course China. China has now a very strong position in Brazil, as in many other countries in Latin America. And it will be hard for a Trump administration to fight that influence, because the US is in no position to offer us an alternative in terms of market or an alternative in terms of investment in infrastructure. So I believe that this is an unavoidable tendency that will continue and will perhaps give rise to disagreements, particularly in matters more sensitive to security, as the use of telecommunications equipment, etc. In relation to other issues, I believe that despite the fact that Trump's attention will be attracted by many geopolitical conflicts in the world, it will concentrate a little bit more on Latin America than the previous administrations, because of his personal concerns with illegal immigration, with drug trafficking, and of course with China's influence. So I think those three components of what we could describe as a negative agenda will guarantee a minimum of unwelcome attention. Of course, some countries will be more sensitive to that pressure than others. I see, for instance, the case of Mexico, Central American countries, as particularly vulnerable. In the case of Brazil, is not so much. And of course, Brazil doesn't depend very much in terms of a bilateral trade on the US. Of course, he can harm us. He did it in his first term, imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum, and probably he will do it again. But in general terms, I don't see much scope for very, very serious deterioration in trade, because the US has ceased to be one of the two first partners of Brazil in trade some time ago. So that is what I would say just to start. I don't want to continue to leave others to comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Continuing with the opening, I hand the floor to Brian Fonseca. Brian, please.
Thanks, Leila, and incredibly reflective comments, Ambassador, so thank you for those. Before I sort of delve into some of the things I think are going to be important for a Trump 2.0 administration, I did want to thank CEBRI, Hussein, and the team at CEBRI for the incredible partnership. I think this is going to be the first in a long series of collaborations between FIU and CEBRI that advances really meaningful dialogue on issues that are of importance to both our countries. And so, I mean, look, as the Trump administration takes office in 2024, I think the future of U.S.-Brazilian relations are going to be shaped by a few things. Certainly, ideological constraints, shifting geopolitical priorities, and of course, the evolving regional and economic landscape. And I think, for the U.S., Brazil's position as a leading Latin American power, could be challenged in sort of the perception of the Trump administration due to some of these things. So I think there are three important considerations that I certainly want to leave with the group to reflect on. I think the first, and this builds on what the ambassador said, Brazil is not going to be a priority for a Trump 2.0 administration. It wasn't a priority for a Trump 1.0 administration. I don't think it's going to be a priority for a 2.0 administration. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. Second, I think the U.S.-Argentina partnership is going to eclipse the prospects of a deeper U.S.-Brazilian relationship. And I think that's important to point out, that that relationship is going to deepen. The U.S. is going to see Argentina as a key partner in South America. And I think that may take some of the steam out of a deepening of U.S.-Brazilian relations. And third, I think there's going to be some deep challenges in the trade and environmental collaboration spaces, and of course, the geopolitical landscape, as the ambassador pointed out, with China. So let me just expand on those for a few minutes, and then I want to make some other anecdotes about some of the tensions between U.S. and Brazil, going into the next administration. So as I said, I don't think Brazil is going to be a priority. I think under a Trump administration, President Lula is going to find himself sort of not at the top of the priority list. For example, I mean, we haven't seen, and we're not even hearing many rumors about who is going to be appointed U.S. ambassador to Brazil. So I don't think that's even up for discussion. Despite earlier this week, the Ambassador Ron Johnson was named to Mexico, and Colombia has already received some names. So OAS was announced yesterday. So again, I think you're starting to see the Trump cabinet, fill out for Latin America, and Brazil hasn't been brought up. I think on one end, there's certainly an ideological divide between, sort of Trump's America First platform and, sort of the preferences of Brazil to pursue multilateralism and engage around environmental advocacy and, of course, regional integration through alliances like, BRICS. And I think that may challenge some of the meaningful collaboration between the United States and Brazil. And I think it's going to manifest in sort of reduced diplomatic engagement, trade tensions for sure, and again, limited U.S. support for Brazil's economic aspirations, especially in the areas of energy and agribusiness. Instead, I think the Trump administration is going to redirect its attention to ideologically aligned nations in the region. And one of the things the ambassador said, which I think is really important, is that Senator Marco Rubio of Florida is nominated to be the Secretary of State. He will go through his confirmation process. And while I agree entirely that a Secretary Rubio will be probably among the most seasoned Latin Americanists to take the seat, I think the challenge is that at that level, Secretary Rubio is going to be dealing with far more complex global issues. And while he's going to want to put attention towards Latin America, I'm not sure the space is going to be there to do that. He's going to have to address the Russia-Ukraine issue, the Israel-Hamas issue, the China global, strategic competition issue, North Korea, sort of European, fragmentation. So I think he's going to have to tackle a lot of other issues on the 7th floor of the State Department building, which is going to probably push Latin America down in terms of prioritization. That's on one end. Two, I also think that a Trump administration is going to find itself at conflict within. I think the way that a Rubio might approach Latin America, particularly as it relates to countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, may diverge from a more pragmatic approach that Trump and maybe Trump's inner circle might prefer. Right now we have sort of two debates going on with respect to relations with Venezuela. You have one advocating for engagement to pursue Trump's immigration and energy agenda, and then the other sort of a return to maximum pressure, which was led by Rubio the first go around, and it didn't succeed. And so you're starting to see that debate, sort of heating up within within, so I think the emerging Trump administration. So again, I think that Brazil will not be a priority in this administration, and there will be some important, important issues around ideological alignment that sort of undermine the deepening of that. The second point I made was that the U.S.-Argentina partnership is going to eclipse the U.S.-Brazilian relationship. I mean, you've seen Milei make several trips up to the U.S. already. He participated in CPAC, which is a major conservative convening. In fact, Argentina hosted CPAC in Buenos Aires last week. And so I think what you're seeing is a sort of a U.S.-Argentina partnership, dominating the U.S.-Latin America agenda for now. You might see Bukele in El Salvador also emerge as a dominant thread in American foreign policy towards the region. But certainly in the context of South America, I think Argentina is going to be the preference for now. The Trump administration is poised to cultivate a strong bilateral relationship with Argentina, and sort of Malay's pro-market reforms and conservative ideology align far more closely with I think Trump and Trump's inner circle, and especially sort of those that Trump has already appointed to positions of cabinet level for the administration. And I think that partnership itself is going to lead to expanded trade agreements, mutual opposition to China's growing influence in the region, even though Milei can do very little about it because of the depth of the Argentine-Chinese economy. Still, Milei is saying a lot of the right things to appeal to the U.S.'s strategic competition concerns. And I think Brazilian risks are going to be, spotlighted, or at least sidelined rather, further complicating Brazil's role in maybe even sort of fanning the competition between Brazil and Argentina and South America again. And then lastly, I talked about challenges to trade and environmental collaboration. And I think the ambassador touched on this as well. Trump administration's protectionist policies, and Leila, when you opened up, you noted sort of that Trump approach, to protectionism, and that is going to conflict very directly with sort of Brazilian economic interest. And so I think, again, Trump's protectionist policies would, following, his first presidency, a withdrawal from global climate initiatives, I think is going to strain U.S.-Brazilian economic and environmental cooperation, I think, in serious ways that could sour even diplomatic relationships in a serious way. And I think those things also have the potential to disrupt Brazil's trade balance, even if U.S. policies, by the way, also impact China, which is Brazil's, as the ambassador pointed out, an important, if not the most important trading partner for Brazil. In environmental matters, Trump's rollback of climate commitments contrasts sharply with Lula's environmental agenda. And I think this is going to create deeper conflict, especially, in areas where the Brazilians are really focused, like the Amazon, and Brazilian leadership in this space. Not having the U.S. aligned, I think, is going to be important. And so I think those three things are going to be, truths coming into this, truths coming into this Trump 2.0. I think one additional sort of, corollary to this, which is maybe trivial, maybe not, but the incredible tension between someone close to Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and sort of Brazilian political elite, right? And that tension may seem, again, trivial, but the reality is Musk has had, a very, close proximity to President Trump. And that may also weigh in on sort of, Trump's, attention towards Brazil. And I think that adds complexity to the U.S., Brazil relations. I think that could lead to a contentious relationship with Brazil's government, including in the areas of bilateral ties, and especially in the technology and energy sectors, maybe even space, if you throw space in there. And Musk, Elon's investments in satellite technology and renewable energy, coupled with the political friction, may, again, further strain the prospects of a deepening of U.S.-Brazil relations in a Trump 2.0. And so I'll leave my comments there, Leila, and look forward to, another round and certainly taking questions as we go further into the discussion.
We're going to have many rounds, Brian. No worries, but thank you. Very, very interesting thoughts. Now I would like to invite Hussein Khalud to share his opening remarks. Hussein.
Thank you, Leila. And it was a pleasure to hear Ambassador Recupero and also from my friend Brian Fonseca. about their opening remarks. So much has been said, and I do agree with both speakers about the future of Trump administration and about the bilateral relation. But I would like to point out some important aspects on that regard. First, we are living in a world with a different conjuncture, right? Vis-a-vis the first Trump administration. So Trump already have experimented how to deal with Latin America, right? Especially in regard to Venezuela, when he tried to endorse a coup d'etat against Maduro's government. And he knows that he cannot go in the same way, and he cannot go in the same direction by alluding for a military intervention there. That won't work. And even Brazil and Venezuela right now, they are not in a good, the relationship appears to not being in a good shape, but Brazil will never endorse any military intervention in Latin America, and especially in South America, right? So, and even if Brazil's current administration does not recognize the legitimacy of the electoral process or of Maduro's victory, right? So the government has already announced that if the Venezuelan government does not present the so-called actas electorales, so the government cannot recognize that Maduro is the winner in the election. So that has generated tension between both sides. And even though Brazil will not endorse whatever we consider is not legal intervention, that does not being ruled under the United Nations rule of law. So that said, and I want to point out the relation first with Latin America. So Trump has understood, in my opinion, that Latin America is quite complex. I do agree with Brian when he said that Trump has a lot to do with the world. There's a lot of problem. Of course, there's the war in Ukraine. There is certain elevated ground of uncertainty and instability right now in the Middle East, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, and so on. So there is a lot to fix and a lot to participate and to negotiate. And nobody knows what will be the reflection of what has happened in Syria across the Middle East, and especially the Levant and the Gulf. So the U.S. future administration will be totally immersed directly or indirectly in that region. So I guess that Secretary Rubio won't have much time to be focused in Latin America, but even Latin America won't be an immediate priority. They have to remain focused in the region because Chinese influence is increasingly rises. And that, as Ambassador Recupero have said, China influence in Latin America is irreversible, right? And to contain China influence, you can do it by being absent, and you cannot stop it by only pressuring. You have to be present in the diplomatic theater in Latin America, and you have to build the ground to pivot a strong economic and partnership with the countries in the region. As much as you are distanced from the region, as much as you are lowering the strategic level of the region and putting Latin America as not among U.S. priorities, that will open that will allow China to navigate freely and to increase its influence in the region. We have seen just the port that China has inaugurated in Peru right now. And the other important point that I want to tackle. If this Trump 2.0 decided to be distant from Latin America, the other risk that I see in the region, and especially in regard to Brazil, Brazil is trying to bounce between US and China. And if a minimum ground of convergences, Trump decide to not build with Brazil, that will drive Brazil totally toward China in this government. So I understand that there's a lot of divergences in the mutual agenda, such as environment, such as multilateralism and other aspects, but certain ground has to be built, certain minimum views of convergences that they has to be preserved between both countries. Otherwise, that will lead Brazil to look only toward China. And that will be dangerous, not for this current administration, but for the future of Brazil and US relationship. Well, Ambassador has emphasized that the expectation is low. Yeah, indeed, that is a real fact. Nobody in Brasilia expects that both sides will come together in important international topics. Nobody expects that the bilateral relations will evolve in positive way, especially regard several countries in the region, and especially in topics that they are important to Brazil. But I think there is some room to work between both countries, right? So there's a lot of US investments in Brazil that could be preserved. The economic tie, where I'm talking about economic tie, trade relationship, it is important no matter what, and that could be, at least in some aspect, could be protected. And when Brian, you raises that US-Argentina relationship could eclipse the US-Brazil relationship, I agree with you when we look at it from the ideological angle. Yeah, of course. From the ideological angle, that definitely makes sense to me. But we have to remember also that we will have, during Trump administration, a presidential election in Argentina. Will Milei will be capable to get reelected? That is an important point to analyze, right? And we will have an election in 2026. So we don't know who's going to win this election too, right? So for the short term, yeah, perhaps you are right. And perhaps from the ideological angle, I think. But the density of Brazil-US trade relationship, it's far much important than US-Argentina. In terms, when I'm talking about trade, in terms of military and defense cooperation too. So that it's important to analyze when we look over strategic relationship in the future, right? I want to raise my last point, and that it's I guess will be very important, because we are like basically a year and 9 months from the Brazilian presidential election. So we are basically a year and a half, or less than a year and a half from the electoral cycle, electoral political cycle in Brazil, right? So basically in April, May 2026, the electoral process starts in Brazil, and will be very important to see how the US administration will, how Trump administration will address that, and what will be the behavior of Trump administration toward the electoral process in Brazil, right? Because that will be crucial, and that will determine the future of, in the short term of the bilateral relationship, especially if the Labor Party in Brazil wins the elections, right? So I will stop here, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Hussein. Finally, but by no means least, I hand the floor to Anthony Pereira.
Thank you, Leila. I hope this is the beginning of a series of events that we can do together. And I think a lot of good things have been said. I'll just pick up on a few of them. I agree very much with Ambassador Recupero that the US agenda towards Latin America is largely negative. And that is unlike previous periods in history. So if you go back to the turn of the 20th century with Taft's dollar diplomacy, or if you go to FDR's Good Neighbor, or if you go to JFK's Alliance for Progress, these were projects for, they were at least marketed as collective projects in which there were benefits for both sides. And that's not the kind of, that's not the rhetoric we're going to get, I don't think, from the Trump administration. And because it's a negative agenda, because it's focused on immigration and drugs, Mexico is key. I know we're here to talk mainly about Brazil, but I think Mexico is the big issue when it comes to Latin America for the Trump administration. And how they're going to deal with Mexico, I think, is a little bit up in the air. There was a very interesting letter from President Sheinbaum that Trump has not responded to about pushing back a little bit on the threats of tariffs in exchange for working on migration and so on. So I think we're in an interesting period in that. And I think, unlike some of these previous periods, if you look at U.S. trade partners, who are the key partners that it sends its exports to? If you exclude Mexico, there isn't a Latin American or Caribbean country that enters the top 15 as an export market for U.S. exports. And so, on the economic side, there's a disconnect. And I think what I wonder on migration as well is that one of the fundamental drivers of migration is the disparity in GDP per capita between Latin America and the Caribbean and the U.S. And that has not changed. Arguably, it's gotten bigger. The gap has gotten bigger between 2020 and 2024, where we are now. In relative terms, it's about a 7-to-1 disparity. But the gap is not closing. So the economic reasons for people to migrate are still very, very strong, no matter how much you militarize the border. And so I think that's an issue that will probably not be addressed by this or any other U.S. administration, but it's there. On Argentina, I do think that I agree with Brian that it'll be prioritized to some extent by the Trump administration, but I'm not sure it's going to end well for Argentina. I think the love affair between Milei and Trump is very unrequited. It's very unequal. And like a lot of unequal love affairs, it can end in tears and accusations of betrayal. And the reason I say that is because I think one of the fundamental interests that Milei has is in U.S. investment in Argentina. And I'm not sure that's going to be forthcoming. If you look at the stock of foreign and direct investment of the U.S. in Latin America, it's very large, including in Brazil. But the new money is mostly coming from China, right? The new money, the new loans, the new foreign investment is mostly coming from China. And the U.S. is not in a position, I think, to compete in that area. And if anything, the U.S. is competing to attract foreign investment that otherwise might go to Latin America, right? It's trying to create incentives through tariffs, through the kind of things that Trump announced just a few days ago about regulatory acceleration for big investments for $1 billion or more. So it's a competitor rather than a collaborator. And I think Ambassador Recupero is very, very accurate when he says that maybe the best that Brazil can hope for in the coming year or two is to stay off the American radar screen to the extent that it can, rather than hope for any kind of strategic partnership, the kind of collaboration that we saw between Biden and Lula. Certainly when it comes to the Trump administration's ability to tip the scales, to tip the political scales in Brazil, I think they're somewhat limited. And I can just as one example, when you looked at the standoff between Elon Musk and the Supreme Court in Brazil, and there was an attempt in the US Congress to push and to sort of threaten Supreme Court justices in Brazil. In the end, Musk paid the fine and complied with the Supreme Court's directives, right, to deplatform some people. And so as much as the hard right in Brazil would be hoping for a Trump assistance in sort of regaining power in 2026, I'm not sure there's that much the Trump administration can do other than be a source of emulation, be an example for people in Brazil to copy or to emulate. So I think we're in for some interesting times, and I do think Brian is probably right about the possible direction of U.S. policy on Venezuela. He's just had a recent, very important paper on that. But I think hopefully, because we're here in Florida, we can pick up some interesting new items before the inauguration that we can share with you in future events with CEBRI, Leila. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm curious about how do you guys see Trump's threat to impose a 25% tariff increase on Mexico and Canada, and if it's going to be the end of US MCA. Ambassador, what do you think about it?
Well, let me see if, first of all, before I answer your question, I would like to comment a little bit on what Anthony just said. I think his intervention made a very important point. The subject of this seminar is not about the prospects for the US and Brazil relationship. It's for hemispheric relations.
Excellent.
And he's right in saying that from that point of view, the most important thing is not concentrate on Brazil, but turn our attention to Mexico, Central America, and other countries. Indeed, Brian had already said, and I totally agree with him, that Brazil will not be a priority for the new administration. That is very clear. No? So my concern is more regarding the overall impact on hemispheric relations of a new administration whose agenda is mostly concentrated on negative items like illegal immigration and drug trafficking, the problem of fentanyl, and an incoming administration that have already been making threats, very serious threats regarding Mexico. It is the first time in my lifetime I remember when an incoming US president has threatened to invade Mexico or to launch missile attacks against criminal groups in Mexico. So if that possibility really materializes, it will be a sort of seismic transformation. There has been many, many years since perhaps the last US intervention in Veracruz, it was in the early 20th century. It is already 100 years that we haven't seen any kind of this type of intervention. So I think we should worry about this prospect because I'm unable to identify anything in the incoming administration that could be seen as a bright light in terms of proposing some kind of a new cooperation, some projects regarding Latin America. Everything that is said about Latin America and about Mexico and the others is extremely negative in content. So what would be the significance of this kind of climate in the next 4 years, considering the geopolitical environment, the situation where we have already seen this tendency to multipolarity, Latin America drifting away from the old patterns of a relationship. So, turning now to your question, if indeed the 20% tariff is applied to Mexico, to Canada, I doubt that it will mean the end of the former NAFTA agreement. I don't think it will end because my impression is that the NAFTA option was an irreversible one. That is, the North American market have already become so integrated in terms of production chains that I don't see a tariff as being able to completely destroy that. Of course, it will be a significant obstacle to the improvement of the commercial relationship among those three countries. But I don't think it will be the end, except if Trump takes some unexpected decision. But you see, even now, there has already been powerful pressure of the US manufacturing industry on Trump because the Americans that have invested in Mexico are extremely concerned with those threats. And I hope that the reaction of the business sector in the US will be enough to moderate at least this intention of Trump. But let me only touch on one minor point that I don't think is extremely important. It's about Argentina. I agree that Argentina is hoping for a much better treatment. And indeed, they need it because they are in very serious need of help by the IMF. And of course, the US could be of great help in getting the funds. This I see as positive. It will be something good to help the Argentinians to try to advance in their economic program. But in the end, I think the success or failure of this approximation will depend on the success or failure of Millei's experience. Because you remember, one should not forget that we have already seen this film before. You remember that during the presidency of Menem. When Menem was president, the Argentinians made a preferential choice for the United States. They even sent 2 warships to the Gulf War, and they received the classification of one of the main US allies outside of NATO. You remember that at the time, the former foreign minister of Argentina said that he wanted relations that were carnal, more than cordial, carnal and abject, he said. But even those exaggerations didn't come to much because finally the Menem term was a failure. So I think it is a good thing if the Argentinians can get some help because they do need it. But I would like to point out that this is not our case. In that sense, Brazil is somewhat immune. Brazil has a very solid, a very sound external position in economic terms. And just to touch on trade, of course, China is our main trading partner. China takes about 28% of Brazilian exports. But don't forget that Asia as a whole, takes almost 50%. So it's not only China. Brazil has a diversified pattern of markets. That is, Brazilian exports are not concentrated on a single market, as is the case of Mexico. Mexico has about 80% of their exports in the United States. For us, the US market is not negligible. By far, it's important, but it's not vital. Of course, it would create a problem for us if we would lose all the market, but I don't think so. I don't think this is likely. We can lose some positions in the US market, but not all the market, because most of the Brazilian exports to the Brazilian market are made of manufactures that are made by US international firms in Brazil. So I don't think that would be, it would be negative, but not vital, as I said. Thank you, and excuse me for speaking a little bit too long.
And it was excellent, Ambassador. Thank you. And still about Mexico, Brian, there is so much at stake in the relationship with Mexico, starting with the entry of illegal immigrants into the US, moving through nearshoring, and even including fentanyl trafficking, as Ambassador pointed out. What leverage does President Claudio Sheinbaum have? Brian, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I was muted. I'm sorry. No, it's a great question. I guess we're going to see the kind of leverage that she can wield as, again, Trump continues to assert, sort of the threats of tariffs and sending, U.S. military operations to support some of the challenges around illegal immigration and fentanyl. So before I get there, I do want to highlight something the ambassador said, because I think it was incredibly, thoughtful, that Argentina is absolutely in need of a deepening relationship with the United States as it goes through its valley of transition with the sort of seemingly extreme position that Milei has taken in terms of rebounding the economy, right? There's a massive valley of transition that Argentina has to go through, and deepening the relationships with the United States, I think, was an important part of that. Whereas, Brazil has, certainly has the economic strength and position globally to stand without requiring a deepening relationship with the United States. So I think there's some dynamics there that I think are really important. And I also agree with the ambassador that I don't think that if tariffs were imposed, that they would undermine the U.S. MCA altogether. It was Lighthouser in the U.S. that helped negotiate that under a first Trump administration when it was rebranded from NAFTA to USMCA. And of course, there were trade dispute mechanisms built into it. I tend to think the threat of sanctions is really the brunt instrument here, and not necessarily, the threat of tariffs is the brunt instrument here, not necessarily the tariffs themselves. But of course, this could escalate where the United States is levying tariffs. And I think that's going to undermine trust. I think that's going to, as the ambassador pointed out, move the private sector to be, far more critical and in opposition of a Trump administration that's sidelining American businesses through some of these brunt instruments of economic power. And so we'll see. On one end, I think, so going back directly to your question about leverage in Mexico. I mean, I'm not sure how much leverage she has coming in. I mean, certainly there are a couple of really important issues that are vital to the Trump agenda that Mexico plays a critical role in. The first is immigration, and the second is fentanyl and illicit flows across the border. And I think from that perspective, the leverage is in the ability to help Trump achieve that agenda, which could mean that Mexico has a really important place in helping with that process. Now, the immigration piece is not exclusively on Mexico, as was pointed out. Sort of as a broader issue. For example, the returning of deportees to Venezuela, for example, in which the Venezuelan government's not accepting deportees. So I mean, the immigration issue goes beyond Mexico, but Mexico has a really important role in it. Whether that's helping stop mass migration coming up through the Central American corridor into Mexico and often across the border there. Between the United States and Mexico, and same thing with the illicit trafficking space. I mean, I think Mexico has an important role to play in helping Trump achieve some of his policy priorities that are both, foreign policy, but also domestic policy priorities. But Trump has to be careful not to push too hard on Mexico, not get the support that the Trump administration needs in Mexico, despite the rhetoric, and then find Mexico further kind of aligning in directions that are disadvantageous to U.S. foreign policy interests, namely China, right? Which again has continued to pop up. And you mentioned something about nearshoring earlier and friendshoring, and I'm not sure how much that is. If you think about what's going on in the Mexico-China context now, I mean, China is propping up Mexican businesses in an effort to kind of weave under the USMCA and ways that undermine American foreign policy and economic interest. And so that could be another important thread that might be leverage for Mexico's government to wield in terms of that broader strategic competition space.
Thank you, Brian. What about Colombia, Anthony? The fact that cocaine production has increased in Colombia could be a source of tension with the U.S. What do you think?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I'm sure the incoming Trump administration would hope for a change of administration there with Petro, with the opposition winning, and maybe they could step up collaboration on the basis of that. But yeah, it's part of that negative agenda that we've been talking about, along with migration, and it is an area of collaboration that I think does work in the region. I mean, it's more. I think it's more effective bilaterally, U.S. with partners in the region, less so maybe intra-regionally. I think, for example, Brazil could probably do more to collaborate with its neighboring countries to address issues of drug trafficking. But yeah, I would expect that to be a priority for them coming in.
Hussein, Brazil is set to assume the BRICS presidency on January 1st. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's threatening retaliation against countries that will move away from using the dollar in their transactions, a trend gaining traction within the BRICS, right? Do you anticipate a bumpy road ahead, Hussein?
Very interesting question. Leila, and very tricky one, actually. Well, I mean, of course, as you know, BRICS enlargement has been perceived by certain countries, especially in the Western Hemisphere, as a threat and somehow, and as anti-Western coalition, right? Eager to antagonize with the Western superpowers and somehow. So that said, Trump administration, I don't know how Trump administration wants to look to the BRICS. But in this regard, we have to also remember that Trump and Putin, they have a different type of relationship, and US and Russia will have a different approach under Trump vis-a-vis Biden, US under Biden and Russia, right? Jumping immediately to your question, I think it's not a reality that the BRICS could abandon the dollar immediately as a currency of trade, right? It's not a reality because the trade within BRICS is quite low. So trade between Brazil and China, trade flow Brazil-China is quite high. It's $100 billion trade flow, right? But the trade among countries within the BRICS, it's when you look to the numbers, it is low, right? So this is the first. Brazil reserve remain in dollars. Brazil is not going to change its reserves to yuan or to ruble or to whatever other currency. So this is another aspect. I think when the BRICS countries talk, when they raise the topic on exchanging substituting the dollar by a whatever currency that the BRICS going to produce, I think that it is mostly in the long term, and we have to see how much that is factible, right? How much that is it's real now in the long term. And by Trump making his threat, I mean it's that Trump want to use that as a political leverage against the BRICS. Want to escalate in somehow the rhetoric, but I don't also perceive as Trump want to implement any effective action against Russia or China, right? Right, because that will be countered by the other two countries, right? And realistically, Brazil, in my opinion, won't abandon the dollar at least in the last 4 or 5 years, or at least in the next 4 or 5 years, or in the next decade. So there's no need for a threat or whatever kind of rhetoric from President Trump.
So we do have a question from Martin Brown, who is watching our debate. He says, some of these questions were answered slightly during the introduction, but I wanted to know if they could be answered more in depth. How might Brazil's growing ties with China shift its alignment with the US, and what role could Argentina play in this dynamic? What geopolitical consequences could arise if the US continues to overlook Latin America in favor of other global priorities? Also, what are the broader implications for US influence, particularly in emerging markets and within multilateral organizations like BRICS, if Brazil deepens ties with China? Wow, lots of issues. Anthony, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I mean, the ambassador might contradict me here, but my impression is that the Lula administration doesn't want to have its China relationship seen as zero sum. In other words, I don't think it's trying to get closer to China to irritate the United States. It would like to have good relations with the United States as well. And in fact, the U.S. itself has very close ties economically with China, a lot of foreign investment, an immense amount of trade. And so so they are symmetrical in that respect. But I do think that there's a kind of relatively new Brazilian interest in the China relationship because of its potential to help Brazil reindustrialize. So the BYD factory, for example, producing electric cars in Brazil, that is very enticing to, I think, Brazilian policymakers because they see the possibility of not just remaining in this very kind of neo-colonial trade relationship where it's commodities, mineral goods and agricultural goods that go to China, but Chinese investment can somehow lead Brazil to get back to its manufacturing base, to rebuild its manufacturing base. And that's, I think the interests converge there. I don't know how, there's also, I think, an interest in tapping Chinese finance for development. And there's a possibility for that, I think, given the difference in interest rates, so that there can be some new lending. And to the, and I think Brazil is just hoping that it doesn't have to choose, that the geopolitical rift does not widen, and so that it's not forced to choose between the U.S. and China, because it does, I think, diplomats in Brazil do worry about becoming over-dependent on China. That's why I think there's an interest in the EU-Mercosur trade deal. My own personal view of that is that it's still more likely not to happen than to happen. But, Ursula von der Leyen came to Uruguay, tried to stimulate the discussion of it. There's probably clearly a sense amongst some European elites that if Trump is going to impose tariffs on Europe, they should try to finalize the negotiations between Mercosur and EU and find a new partner in Mercosur. So that's, it's still alive, even though I think it's difficult to actually achieve because, if there are enough countries in the European Union that don't want to ratify it, it'll never get over the line. But I think this idea of China being a potential partner with Brazil to reindustrialize is a very interesting one, and it does make the relationship more important rather than less important for Brazil.
Thank you, Anthony. Ambassador, would you like to add your take on that?
Oh, yes. Let me say that, in my opinion, I don't see really I don't remember the three questions well. Could you repeat it?
Sure, no problem, of course. So here, how might Brazil's growing ties with China shift its alignment with the US, and what role could Argentina play in this dynamic? What geopolitical consequences could arise if the US continues to overlook Latin America in favor of other global priorities? Also, what are the broader implications for US influence, particularly in emerging markets and within multilateral organizations like BRICS, if Brazil deepens ties with China?
Well, I totally agree with Anthony that Brazil doesn't want to be seen as siding with China in this antagonism between the two countries. On the contrary, very often Brazil has clearly expressed his position that we should try to avoid deepening the antagonism between the US and China. For us, the ideal world would be a world where the US and China would find some accommodation, some modus vivendi, and we would not be threatened with the return of a sort of a new Cold War. So we don't want to take sides. And this is not only because we wish to defend our autonomy in terms of foreign policy, but also because despite all the strong economic ties that we have with China, our values our values, our ideals are Western. We are much closer to the US in terms of the kind of a political system that we wish to see consolidate in Brazil. We are in favor of democracy, human rights, a number of things that China and Russia are not known as favoring. So we would not choose to betray our values. And indeed, even if a specific government would be tempted to do it, that government would never find enough social support in Brazilian society. You know that the Brazilian society is deeply divided. It's even polarized, almost 50% on each side. And there is a very strong current of opinion in Brazil that may possibly win the next elections, which has a much more conservative outlook, which is much more pro-Western in its leanings. So I really don't see that happening because the current government in Brazil is aware of that fact. He is very careful not to go beyond the red line that would be taking side in favor of China. I don't think this will ever happen in Brazil. You know, I think it is practically an impossibility. Regarding Argentina, once again, I welcome the possibility of Argentina finding financial help from the Trump administration. But you should never forget that Argentina has also a stronger relationship with Brazil in economic terms. Argentina depends on the Brazilian market much more than it will depend on the US market. So the Argentinians will never do anything rash. They will never try to do something that would alienate Brazil in such a way that would be the end of Mercosur. Of course, they will try to get some kind of agreement with the US, if possible, some trade deal. I don't know how that will be accommodated within Mercosur, but anyway, they are very keenly aware of that. You know, even in recent weeks, they have been sending to Brazil Luiz Caputo, the Minister of the Economy, and even the sister of Milei, to talk to the Brazilian industrialists. They were here in Fiesp, in the Industrial Federation in São Paulo, only 2 weeks ago. So they cultivating, because, you know, despite Milei's rhetoric, he's a realist. You saw that at the beginning, he had been saying some terrible things about China, but finally, when he became president, he recognized that Argentina depended even in a line of financing from China. No? So he asked the Chinese to keep that line functioning. So I don't think this will happen. Just to finalize my intervention and addressing the third part of your the question of our friend, you see, I think it's really sad that we have been here for more than 1 hour now, and we have practically concentrated on negative things. You know, if you think that we are discussing a new U.S. administration, in normal times, we would have spoken about threats, but also opportunities. But no one of us was able to come up with any opportunity in positive terms. So this is a sad reflection on the state, not only of the US, but of the world in general, no? How negative things have been going. And to be frank, as someone who has been very much involved with relations with the United States, I do hope that the US will develop a more positive view of the relations with Latin America, not perceive Latin America just as a land of threats, of illegal immigrants, of fentanyl, drug trafficking, etc., but to see some kind of positive cooperation that would be possible. You see, in that terms, the relationship with China or Europe, even if in relative terms, at least has a constructive element. For instance, nobody can tell whether the agreement between Mercosur and the European Union will really be functioning in some years. But it was a very positive development that the two sides were able to accommodate their different positions, and finally we agreed on a text. The same about China, you know, the recent visit by President Xi in Brazil was the occasion of the signature of almost 40 agreements. Of course, there are minor agreements, but they signalize a positive content. So I would expect that Americans can have some kind of positive agenda for Latin America, not for Brazil alone, huh? For the countries in Latin America, because what could be, can you think about the US leadership in the world if in its own region it is seen as a hateful country? How can you imagine that a hegemon that is hated? You know, from the Gramsci's concept, an hegemon dominates not by force, but by moral and intellectual superiority, by example. How can we imagine a future of hemispheric relations where the content is only threats?
And as a role model, a president who has exhibited anti-democratic behavior, especially with regard to the events of January 6th, as we know. Anyway, we do have another question from, this one is from Guilherme Casarões, Senior Fellow at CEBRI. Thank you for the insightful remarks. What are the prospects for Venezuela after Maduro's inauguration, and how could Brazil navigate a situation in which it no longer works smoothly with the Venezuelan government? Brian, would you like to answer that?
Short answer is no. I think that is a question for Hussein. That's a very difficult.
That's true. You know, I think
No.
so too. Hussein.
No. I do want to make one comment, though, because I think the ambassador hit on something really important. And it was in Martin's question. By the way, Martin Brown, a student at FIU, a stellar student at FIU. So I appreciate his questions. But he said something there that I think could have also provoked the ambassador's comments, and that is about sort of the U.S. overlooking Latin America. And at times I've had sort of challenges with that because, I mean, the U.S. has made and continues to make significant investments in Latin America. The challenge, at least from a perception perspective, is that that Latin America is not a priority for the United States because the reality is the United States is engaged globally and there are bigger fires throughout the world that the United States puts more of its attention on. And that gives the perception that Latin America is overlooked. But I know, whether it's the Biden administration, the previous Trump administration, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, there have been incredible thought leaders throughout the U.S. government that have put significant time in deepening relations with the Americas. And you think about, just sort of the proximity is one thing, but the tremendous cultural proximity in which Latinos in the United States are the largest, fastest growing demographic. There is no doubt that they are shaping the outcome of American elections. They have deep relationships back in the region. And so there's tremendous connective tissue from a cultural perspective. The economic ties are incredibly deep, whether that's USMCA, where we talked about, with Mexico and Canada being, 1 and 2 of the US's largest trading partners, but CAFTA-DR and a list of other sort of economic engagements. And so, again, I don't think the US is overlooked. I think the US has had to shift attention globally to fires, and Latin America hasn't been a fire, persistently. There's also deep security engagement across the hemisphere on issues around drug trafficking and counterterrorism, and even environmental issues. For example, issues around deforestation, which the U.S. engages. So, I mean, I just wanted to frame that a little differently because I think Ambassador's right. We've talked a lot about sort of the threat perception, but there's deep, connections, I think, with the region. And I do want to hear Hussein's perspective on Brazil, Venezuela. But I'll say before I hand it back to you, Leila and Hussein, is that what's interesting is that, Lula represents sort of a part of Latin America left that still relies heavily on elections, right? As a means of preserving, political power. This is the same for Petro. This is the same for Boric. And so the Latin America left has to be very careful about its alignment with a Venezuela post January 10th, when it's clear that government has no longer, maintained respect for democratic process, and that puts the Latin America left, I think, in an interesting, and Lula in an interesting place, because while he wants to be pragmatic with Venezuela, he has to be careful as not to endorse the means by which Maduro has maintained power by completely discounting elections as part of the important sort of democratic institutions. Anyway, I'll say that, but certainly, Hussein, I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Go ahead, Hussein.
You portrayed in a very good and accurate way. First, I don't see much room for in the short term where Brazil could repositionate itself in the Venezuelan topic, right? In the short term. Brazil doesn't have, for the moment, any leverage. And I don't think, personally, that President Lula wants to play any political card with in Venezuela in the near future. This is my own assessment. Maduro's inauguration, it is in the beginning of the next year, right? So what we have to observe, it is definitely President Lula is not going to show up, and we have to observe if the Brazilian government going to send someone, some high-ranked official. From there, we will have a better picture on that, and whom will be sent in which rank. If Brazil decide to send no one, not the vice president, not the foreign minister, no one from the executive branch, that is a clear sign on that Brazil is not recognizing the new mandate of Maduro. So that also give Brazil a very important card to decide what Lula's administration want to do if they decide to play further any negotiation process with the Venezuelan regime. Third, in my opinion, Maduro need to get in BRICS, and he's eager to become member of BRICS. So how Brazil gonna play that card is also revealing and important, right? But does Brazil want Venezuela in BRICS too? And why for, and at what at cost? So how much that will cost to Brazil, and how that will cost to the image to the president Lula himself. So I think we will be close also to the electoral process. Venezuela has already generated a lot of damage to the image and to the reputation of this administration. So the current government, knows that making concession to Maduro is not worthy, because the government has made a lot of concession to Maduro in the last 2 years, and the government ended up with empty hands. And Maduro betrayed all, in the perception of some politicians and some diplomats, betrayed what he has promised to the Brazilian government, right? So, and as you said, all effort that Lula has made with Petro, with Colombia, with Mexico, by creating the group composed by Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, Maduro obliterated all this effort. So I think for the moment, Brazil will be kind of acting hands off from Venezuela and let Maduro navigate alone his destiny, right? That's what I can see in the near future. So Brazil has to create a certain, to repositionate itself for the medium term, to reestablish its card to play in Venezuela, not in the short term, because they don't have it. They don't have any leverage in the short period.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and as far as the United States and Venezuela are concerned, in light of U.S. shale gas, Venezuelan oil is no longer such a strategic resource. You have to keep that in mind. But we are running out of time, and we have time for one more question from Cesar Munoz. Well, actually, he sent two questions, but I will ask one of them, the second one. And I would like Ambassador Recupero to answer, because he was his former Minister of Environment, right? Of the Environment. So the question is, could you comment on the impact of a Trump administration on the environment? Do you expect concrete impact on the ground, such as increased deforestation in the Amazon? How does the election of Trump change Brazilian expectations and goals for COP30, Ambassador? And with your answer, we're going to end our wonderful debate.
Well, thank you. My impression is that Trump's overall impact on environmental matters will be very negative. First of all, in terms of the U.S. domestic policy, he will probably abandon all the policies adopted by Biden. Although one must take into consideration that there is some degree of autonomy by many states in the U.S. Federation. California, for instance, those states will keep their policies of fighting global warming. But in general terms, he will be a retrocession, probably during his term, U.S. emissions will increase. You know that U.S. emissions had been reduced sharply in the last few years. And we all hope that this trend would continue. So this will have an impact on the atmosphere. And of course, he will also play a very negative role in multilateral negotiations. He has already said and repeated that he will leave the Paris Agreement again. So it will be a blow to multilateral efforts to do something concrete. Practically, we will have 4 more lost years. My only doubt is whether we are not nearing a point of no return. Of course, no one can answer this question. As a direct impact on Brazilian policies, I don't think it will have one, you know. For instance, the Brazilian policy of fighting deforestation in the Amazon is struggling with the domestic problems themselves, huh? The difficulty of having a presence in that region, a policy that has to rely very much on fines and so on. But I don't think there will be any impact from a foreign government in our policy, except, of course, if Brazil in the future elects a new rightist government. In that case, you could have a change in the Brazilian domestic policy. In general terms, I will say that perhaps of all the negative aspects that Trump represents, the worst one for the world as a whole is the impact he will have on environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And with that, we'll have to schedule another webinar, another debate after the 2026 election for sure. Anyway, thank you guys so much for your answers. Thank you for this high-level exchange of ideas. I believe we have accomplished the mission of our event and covered several topics, some of them quite thorny. And with that, I'd like to thank our
Leila,
viewers. Sure.
Just a moment. I heard that Anthony had mentioned that Brian has a paper of Venezuela. So if I well understand, I would like very much if he could share the paper with us.
Perfect. I'd like to read it too. So thanks to our viewers and to those who sent questions. Thanks to our interpreters as well, as we've had simultaneous interpretation. Thanks to the production of this event. With that, I bid you farewell. It was a pleasure. Until next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.